Part 2. Queen in a Roman World. C. 5144 BCE. Chapter 3. The third player in Caesar's game. The first years of my reign were a trial by fire. No sooner had I settled onto the throne than I felt it tremble beneath me. Though officially I ruled alongside my brother husband, Ptolemy XIII, in truth, I took charge of Egypt's affairs. He was a child, still fascinated by toy soldiers, while I wrestled with grain reports and Roman dispatches. And I, though only just a woman grown, was determined to govern as my father intended. With the double crown still feeling both heavy and exhilarating on my brow, I began cutting a figure quite unlike any queen the courtiers had expected. At court, I received petitioners personally, listening to Greek merchants and Egyptian farmers alike with equal gravity, switching languages effortlessly to put them at ease and glean the truth behind their words. In the treasury, I pored over accounts, my fingers stained with ink late into the night, trimming unnecessary luxuries so grain could be stored for lean times. Some whispered I worked like a clerk, not a queen. I took it as a compliment. It meant I cared. But to those who had grown comfortable under a pliable old king, my assertiveness was deeply unsettling. Chief among the discontented were my brother's guardians, the very men who had nudged him onto the throne room dais, who wished to rule through him. Pothinus the eunuch, our chamberlain, had a tongue as smooth as oil and eyes that missed nothing. Achilles, commander of the army, was a bull of a man, brave on the battlefield, but lacking finesse in counsel. And Theodotus of Chios, my brother's tutor, hid venomous cunning behind the guise of an amiable old pedagogue. These three had expected to manage a boy king like a puppet. Instead, they found a queen who signed orders with a bold hand, consulted with scholars from the Moussaillon, and deliberately marginalized their influence. Their resentment simmered, almost palpable in the palace corridors. Open confrontation came in the second year of our reign. The Nile's floods were disappointingly low that season, causing poor harvests. Hunger began to stalk the countryside, its grim shadow falling even on Alexandria's teeming alleys. I mobilized relief, distributing royal grain stores, but supplies were scarce. Naturally, people looked for someone to blame. Whispers in the city, like insidious vapors, blamed the drought on divine disfavor, perhaps because a woman was ruling too strongly for Maat, undermining the cosmic balance. Whispers I knew Pothinus encouraged with subtle nods and carefully placed rumors among the court and priests. I would not sit idle while my people suffered and my enemies schemed. In those anxious days, I convened a public council in the palace courtyard, something unheard of. I invited not only nobles, but also priests, scholars, even representatives of the grain merchants and farmers, to discuss how to alleviate the famine. Under the bright sun, before a crowd of onlookers, I listened to grievances and proposed measures. Using the royal granaries to feed the poorest, offering land tax remissions to farmers. My Greek counselors balked at my willingness to open the royal purse, but I silenced them with a stare that promised consequence. By the end of that assembly, I had earned the tentative gratitude of many common Egyptians. However, I had also thrown down a gauntlet to the traditionalists. Cleopatra would not be a mere figurehead, secluded behind palace walls. This was too much for the trio of Pothinus, Achilles, and Theodotus. They saw in my popularity and independence a direct threat to their control over the boy king and the kingdom's levers of power. And so, under the guise of my young brother's authority, they began to act against me. Subtle things at first, a delay in carrying out my edicts, the quiet removal of my loyalists from key posts, the spreading of pernicious rumors that I intended to depose Ptolemy XIII and rule alone. I did, in fact, wish to rule alone, believing Egypt needed singular, decisive leadership, but I had given them no overt reason to think I would discard my brother violently. The irony was that their very paranoia made conflict inevitable. By the third year of our joint reign, the palace had split into factions. I still held the loyalty of many Greek nobles who valued stability, and of the native Egyptian establishment that appreciated my embrace of their customs and language. My brother's faction held the might of the standing army under Achilles and controlled the treasury through Pothinus's machinations. Theodotus, slyly tutoring my brother in hatred and suspicion, twisting my actions into slights against him, even had the boy king sign a decree stripping me of certain official titles. When I discovered that official documents, crucial decrees regarding trade and land grants, no longer bore my name alongside his, an insult and a direct challenge to my authority as co-regent, I knew I could no longer tolerate their undermining tactics. I confronted my brother directly. I swept into his quarters unannounced, startling the tutors and servants milling about. Ptolemy XIII, only 12, but already parroting the arrogance of those around him, stood up from a table strewn with scrolls, affecting a regal pose that barely masked his boyishness. "Sister," he began coolly, echoing words clearly fed to him, "you forget that you should request an audience with your king." It took all my self-control not to laugh bitterly. I dismissed the servants with a curt flick of my hand. They glanced uncertainly towards Pothinus, who hovered in a corner like a smug, poisonous shadow. Pothinus gave a slight condescending nod, allowing them to obey me this once. Only then did they scurry out, leaving the core players in this dangerous game. In that room were the four of us, my brother, radiating borrowed defiance, Pothinus, the master manipulator, Theodotus, the serpent-tongued tutor, and myself, Queen of Egypt, momentarily pushed to the edge. Achilles was absent, likely drilling troops, preparing for the clash we all sensed was coming. I held up a papyrus, the ink still dark. "Why is my name missing from this decree, brother?" I asked, voice steady but deliberately low and sharp, cutting through the chamber's tension. "We are meant to rule together, as Father willed." Ptolemy's eyes darted nervously to Pothinus, then back to me. "I am Pharaoh too," he replied, his voice cracking slightly on the last syllable. I do not need to explain my every act to you." Theodotus coughed delicately, stepping forward with feigned conciliation. "Your Majesty, the Queen's name was omitted by oversight, no doubt. The scribes can be terribly careless." His insincere sympathy made my skin prickle. I ignored the tutor and stepped closer to Ptolemy. He was shorter than me, still thin with the awkwardness of adolescence. I could see a faint spattering of freckles across his royal nose, and in that moment, a pang of sisterly sadness struck me. This was my little brother, whom I used to rock to sleep, yet now he glared at me as though I were a stranger, an enemy sculpted by his handlers. Softening my tone, attempting reason one last time, I pleaded, "Ptolemy, do not be misled by those who whisper poison in your ear. We are family. Our father wished us to work in tandem for Egypt's good. I have been doing only what is needed to keep our kingdom strong in these difficult times of famine and unrest." "Your father also wished you to obey your husband," Pothinus interjected sharply, stepping forward boldly, no longer bothering with pretense, "and to consult wise counsel. Instead, you have squandered the treasury on grain for peasants and temples for your own vanity projects." His voice rose, laced with contempt. "How dare you?" I shot back, my temper finally flaring, the goddess queen pushing aside the measured diplomat. "I have done what is necessary to avert rebellion. Or would you prefer the people riot in the streets from hunger, as they did when my father was exiled? Is that the stability you offer Egypt?" That struck a nerve. Pothinus's pale face contorted with fury. "You overstep, Cleopatra. Need I remind you, you rule only by the grace of Ptolemy XIII and the will of the gods." I cut him off, voice ringing with the authority I felt down to my bones. "And I am the living daughter of those gods, the incarnate Isis on the throne of Egypt." Perhaps it was too imperious, but I was beyond cautious words. "I will not be dismissed by a eunuch servant." Ptolemy flushed crimson, his childish pride wounded by my dismissal of his chief advisor. "He's not a servant, he's the regent." My brother's voice cracked again, but the fury in it was real, fueled by Pothinus's constant manipulation. You think yourself a goddess? Sisters of Isis do not defy the laws and traditions of the two lands. You are the one who forgets your place. Theodotus stepped between us with false concern, as though fearing I might actually strike the boy. This is unseemly, he clucked, casting disapproving glances. A squabble that benefits only our enemies. Perhaps Her Majesty should retire to her own quarters and reflect on proper decorum. Allow the King's Regent to manage affairs. I realized then, with chilling certainty, that no entreaty, no appeal to family or reason, no show of strength would sway them. They had already decided I must be removed, confined, exiled, perhaps even eliminated, as Berenice had been before me. My continued presence was an intolerable obstacle to their ambition. My best chance, indeed my only chance, was to retreat strategically and regroup. With a final glare that promised retribution, I swept out of the chamber without another word, my royal cape swirling behind me like a storm cloud. That night, my closest allies urged me to act first, to arrest Pothinus and Theodotus, perhaps even to confine Ptolemy to the palace for his own protection. But Achilles commanded the palace guard and the bulk of the army. Any attempt to seize the others could spark immediate, bloody civil war within Alexandria's walls. Worse, I suspected we might not win that confrontation. Achilles had slowly replaced many key garrison commanders with men personally loyal to him and beholden to Pothinus's patronage. So I made the hardest decision of my life thus far. I chose exile once more, before exile could be brutally forced upon me. Learning from Berenice's fate, I knew clinging stubbornly to the palace meant risking capture and execution. Retreat offered the possibility of return. Under cover of darkness, I slipped out of Alexandria with a small entourage of trusted servants and soldiers still fiercely loyal to me. My younger sister Arsinoe came as well, though not by my specific invitation. In truth, Arsinoe, now a restless, ambitious girl of about 13, insisted on joining me. Perhaps she calculated her prospects were better tied to my star than languishing under our brother's guardians. Or perhaps she simply craved adventure and saw an opportunity in the chaos. She was headstrong and bold, always eager to step out from my shadow, possessing a fiery charisma I recognized, uneasily, as a reflection of my own drive. Whatever her complex reasons, I did not refuse her when she appeared at the secret harbor rendezvous with tears in her eyes, begging I take her with me. In retrospect, perhaps I should have been more wary of nurturing another potential rival. But in that moment, sisterly feeling, or perhaps mere expediency, won out. We sailed east along the coast, putting distance between us and Pothinus' reach, eventually finding refuge in Syria near Ascalon, a region traditionally friendly to our dynasty. As our ship cut through the dark waves, I stood on deck watching the faint, distant glow of Alexandria recede behind us, my heart pounding with a mix of cold fear and fierce determination. It was happening again. I was leaving my home under duress. But this time, I was not a helpless child following her father into the unknown. I was a queen deposed, yes, but a queen with knowledge, connections, and an unyielding will to reclaim my birthright. I would return not by the fickle will of Roman arms alone, but forged stronger by my own cunning and strength. In Syria, I moved quickly, wasting no time on lamentation. My immediate task was to raise an army. Egypt's volatile eastern neighbors were rife with mercenaries, hardened Greek veterans adrift after countless regional wars, fierce Arab horsemen from the deserts south of Palestine, disciplined Jewish warriors, renowned for their loyalty and skill with sling and bow. I had brought a chest of gold and jewels salvaged from my private treasury. One must never flee empty-handed. These became my essential tools of persuasion. Over long days and nights, in the smoky back rooms of coastal taverns, and within the dusty confines of desert encampment tents, I negotiated contracts, promised significant rewards, and, most importantly, inspired men with my vision and charisma. I spoke passionately of reclaiming my throne, of delivering Egypt from the clutches of corrupt courtiers who starved the people and betrayed my father's legacy. I did not need to feign passion. It poured out of me like the Nile in flood, raw and compelling. Piece by piece, employing every ounce of diplomatic skill and leveraging my royal name, I forged a modest but motivated fighting force that swore loyalty directly to me, Cleopatra. Arsinoe watched all of this with bright, intensely eager eyes. She possessed a natural, if untrained charisma, and I sometimes allowed her to address certain groups of recruits under my careful guidance. I thought it might bolster her sense of inclusion and purpose, perhaps keeping her restless ambition focused on our shared goal, preventing potential mischief born of boredom or resentment. In those moments, seeing her fiery enthusiasm, I almost felt a fleeting sisterly pride, perhaps observing a reflection of my own youthful fervor, before exile and betrayal had tempered it with harder lessons. We were two exiled princesses after all, plotting together to regain our birthright against formidable odds. By the summer of 48 BCE, after months of tireless effort, I judged the time ripe. My forces, though smaller than the official Egyptian army under Achilles, were fiercely loyal to me personally and eager for the promised rewards of victory. Meanwhile, reports from Alexandria suggested Ptolemy's regime was struggling. Their heavy-handed rule, and my own carefully disseminated propaganda, painting them as illegitimate usurpers, had sown seeds of considerable unrest among the populace and within certain factions of the Egyptian priesthood. The plan was clear: march along the coast toward Pelusium once again, the same strategic gateway fortress my father had stormed years before. History, it seemed, had a compelling way of circling back upon itself. We launched our expedition at first light one scorching Syrian morning. I rode at the head of my ragtag but determined army, clad in practical light armor over my linen tunic, a simple diadem securing my braided hair beneath my helmet. Arsinoe rode nearby, attempting to mask her obvious nerves with a forced display of bravado. The desert wind whipped at our makeshift banners, emblazoned with the royal eagle and the golden Isis crown. But fate, that unpredictable weaver of mortal destinies, intervened dramatically before our army even clashed with Ptolemy's border forces. As we neared Egypt's frontier east of Pelusium, startling news reached us like a thunderbolt striking from a clear sky. Pompey the Great, the mighty Roman general, was dead, murdered ignominiously upon stepping ashore near Pelusium seeking refuge in Egypt. Pompey, our family's one-time savior, my father's hesitant patron, the man who had loomed so large in Rome's destiny, had met a sudden and grisly fate. He had lost the decisive battle of the Roman Civil War at Pharsalus in Greece against his rival, the brilliant and ambitious Julius Caesar. Fleeing the catastrophic defeat, Pompey had sought sanctuary in the very kingdom he had helped restore years earlier, our Egypt. Instead of finding shelter, he found treachery. Pothinus and Attalus, those short-sighted, calculating ingrates, ever eager to curry favor with the seeming winner, had lured Pompey into a small boat, murdered him offshore, and struck off his head, intending it as a grotesque welcoming gift for the approaching Julius Caesar. I felt the arid ground seem to tilt beneath me when I received this shocking news. Pompey dead, betrayed and murdered on Egyptian soil, and Julius Caesar, the undisputed victor of Rome's bloody civil war, now arriving in Egyptian waters with warships hot on Pompey's heels. The vast conflict that had consumed the Roman world was now crashing directly onto my shores, bringing with it a potential ally, or devastating enemy, of unimaginable power and consequence. For a stunned moment, despair threatened to overwhelm me. Pompey's death potentially nullified any remaining obligation Rome felt towards upholding my father's will regarding my co-rule. What would the victorious Caesar do in Egypt? Would he recognize Ptolemy's faction, the ones who offered him Pompey's head? Or might he, perhaps, be willing to arbitrate our sibling conflict differently, especially given Pompey's connection to my family? Then, with startling clarity, I realized the immense, dangerous opportunity concealed within this disaster. With one swift, brutal stroke, the murder of Pompey, Pothinus and his circle had severed their connection to Rome's old established order and inadvertently cast themselves into deep uncertainty regarding Caesar's reaction. If I could reach Caesar first, before my brother's advisors could fully secure his favor, perhaps I could turn this sudden chaos dramatically to my advantage. I called an immediate halt to our army's march. My commanders were perplexed. Victory against Ptolemy's demoralized border forces seemed potentially within reach, especially with Caesar's arrival throwing Alexandria's regime into confusion. They urged pressing the attack on Pelusium immediately to capitalize on the situation, but my intuition, sharpened by years of precarious survival, screamed that direct military confrontation was no longer the decisive factor. Julius Caesar, renowned general, consul of Rome, victor of Pharsalus, now effectively the most powerful man in the known world, was on Egyptian soil, or nearing it. Everything, absolutely everything, now hinged on winning him over. In that critical moment, balancing risk and reward with the speed of thought honed by necessity, I decided to gamble everything on my wit, my charisma, and the power of direct personal appeal. War could wait. High-stakes diplomacy could not. Leaving my mercenary army camped cautiously at the border under the nominal command of a trusted general, with Arsinoe instructed to maintain order and await my signal, I handpicked only my most resourceful and loyal attendant, Apollodorus, a steadfast Sicilian Greek utterly devoted to my cause. Together, under the cloak of urgent secrecy, we procured a small, unassuming fishing boat and set sail westward along the coast, racing toward Alexandria. It was an audacious, incredibly dangerous move, sailing directly into the harbor potentially controlled by my enemies and occupied by an unpredictable Roman conqueror. But I knew that swiftness, surprise, and boldness were now my strongest allies. Under a moonless sky, our small craft slipped silently into the vast, complex network of Alexandria's great harbor. The familiar beam of the Pharos lighthouse swept rhythmically overhead, a comforting yet strangely impersonal eye in the darkness, but we hugged the shadows of the breakwaters and anchored ships, avoiding patrols. Word had reached us through fishermen's whispers. Caesar had indeed entered the city, bringing only a relatively small contingent of troops, and had boldly taken up quarters within the royal palace itself, occupying my own home as a self-invited, imposing arbiter between myself and Ptolemy's faction. Meanwhile, my brother's army, commanded by Achilles, now effectively encircled the city from the landward side, trapping Caesar inside. Tension hung thick and palpable over Alexandria's moonlit streets. For the moment, no open fighting had erupted between Caesar and Ptolemy's forces. Perhaps Caesar, the master strategist, was deliberately stalling, assessing the complex situation, weighing his options, as was his renowned style. I knew I had to reach Caesar personally, and crucially, without alerting Pothinus or Achilles to my presence within the city limits. If they caught wind that I, Cleopatra, their rival queen, was back in Alexandria, they would surely intercept and kill me without hesitation before I could ever speak a single word to the Roman general who now held the key to my future. Thus was born a plan as breathtakingly audacious as it was deceptively simple, relying on daring, disguise, and the element of profound surprise. Disguising myself in a plain, dark travel cloak that obscured my features and royal bearing, I landed with Apollodorus at a quiet, less guarded section of the docks near the palace's seaward entrances. Approaching a heavily guarded postern gate leading into the palace complex, proper required nerve. Apollodorus, a powerfully built man with a naturally confident grin that could disarm suspicion, stepped forward boldly. He carried over his broad shoulders a long, bulky roll of what appeared to be bedding or perhaps valuable carpets, bound tightly with ropes, a plausible offering or piece of baggage. Addressing the Roman sentries in passable Latin mixed with Greek, Apollodorus claimed with bluff heartiness to be delivering a unique and valuable gift, a particularly fine carpet, he explained, intended for the personal appreciation of the great General Caesar, sent by a wealthy Alexandrian merchant eager to show respect. Inside that rolled-up bundle, curled tightly into the smallest possible space, scarcely daring to breathe, lay Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, smuggled towards her destiny like contraband. Moments later, my heart thundering against my ribs so loudly I feared the guards might hear. I felt myself being lifted, the rough sacking scratching against my cheek. Through tiny gaps in the weave, I caught disorienting slivers of familiar torchlit corridors, glimpses of the palace's richly painted ceilings and polished marble floors passing above me. We were inside. I heard the resonant sounds of Latin voices conversing nearby, then a deep, authoritative voice granting permission for Apollodorus to enter a specific chamber. At last, after what felt like an eternity cramped in stifling darkness, I felt the bundle being lowered carefully to the ground inside a well-lit room. The rough cloth ties were swiftly unfurled by Apollodorus, and I tumbled out, breathless and inevitably somewhat disheveled, onto a cool mosaic floor depicting scenes from the Nile directly at the sandaled feet of Gaius Julius Caesar. "By Hercules!" exclaimed Caesar, startled, leaping back a step as I quickly gathered myself, rose gracefully to my feet despite the awkward entrance, and threw back the hood of my cloak to reveal my face. If I live through 1,000 lifetimes in the Duat, I shall never forget that first critical sight of him. A man in his early 50s, leaner than his statue suggested, with a high forehead receding slightly, penetrating dark eyes that missed nothing, and a face etched with lines of command, intellectual intensity, and perhaps a hint of weariness, yet radiating an undeniable aura of contained power and immense self-assurance. He wore the purple-bordered toga of a Roman magistrate, and over it, loosely draped, the scarlet cloak of a general. There was a moment of charged silence as those piercing, intelligent eyes took in the wholly unexpected, dust-covered, but undeniably regal young woman who had just materialized from a carpet roll at his feet. Before he could fully process the shock, I dropped into a deep formal curtsy, bowing my head respectfully, yet meeting his gaze as I rose. In clear, carefully modulated Latin, pitching my voice to be both deferential to his power and yet resonant with my own inherent authority, I greeted him, "Ave, Caesar, I am Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, though currently a queen in exile from her own palace. I present myself to you, not merely as a supplicant seeking favor, but as a sovereign ally you have not yet had the pleasure of truly knowing." A slow smile, a mixture of utter surprise, sheer amusement, and perhaps grudging admiration, crept onto Caesar's usually impassive face. He processed the situation with astonishing speed. Extending a lean, strong hand, he gestured for me to rise fully. "Queen Cleopatra," he replied, his Latin measured, cultured, and carrying an undertone of ironic delight. "You make a most memorable entrance." I allowed myself a small smile then, letting a hint of playful confidence reach my eyes, meeting his intellectual curiosity with my own. "Desperate times require inventive measures, Imperator. Forgive my unconventional arrival. I trust I did not unduly startle the conqueror of Gaul?" He chuckled, a dry but genuine sound. "Startled? Most certainly, but also intrigued. It appears the rumors of your resourcefulness and spirit were not mere exaggerations." So, news of me, Cleopatra, had reached him, and then, even amidst the chaos of civil war, I wondered what precisely he had heard tales of my ambition, my learning, my conflict with Pothinus. But that could wait. I sensed a unique, pivotal opportunity opening before me and seized it without hesitation. Motioning discreetly for the beaming Apollodorus to withdraw to the edge of the room, I began to engage Caesar directly in conversation. Words flowed easily between us, an immediate current of intellectual connection passing between Rome's master strategist and Alexandria's philosopher queen. I recounted a brief, carefully shaped version of my plight, emphasizing my father's long-standing alliance with Rome, conveniently glossing over its often troubled nature, detailing his dying wish that I rule alongside my brother, and painting a stark picture of how that brother's corrupt advisors had unjustly driven me out endangering Egypt's stability and thus Rome's interests in the region. I spoke not with self-pity, but with the passion of a monarch fighting for her kingdom's welfare, explaining that a strong, stable Egypt under a decisive ruler, with a subtle emphasis on singular ruler, would be far more beneficial to Rome than the current chaotic regime governed by Pompey's murderers. Caesar listened intently, arms crossed, his head tilted slightly, occasionally interjecting with sharp, pointed questions that probed the weaknesses in my narrative. His reputation as a brilliant orator and cunning politician was vividly evident in his every query. He wanted to know, for instance, the true reasons behind the popular revolt against my father years earlier, pressing me on whether the fault lay fundamentally with our dynasty's perceived misrule or simply with unfortunate economic circumstances exploited by rivals. I answered with calculated candor, acknowledging my father's difficult struggle to balance the heavy demands of Roman tribute with the needs of his people, and explaining that my own approach had been precisely to alleviate those internal burdens by prioritizing Egyptian interests, hence why the current regime, beholden to short-sighted greed, so fiercely opposed me. He observed me keenly as I spoke, his gaze almost physically weighing my words, my expressions, my very essence, as though evaluating not just a potential ally, but perhaps a kindred spirit in the ruthless game of power. I realized that beyond politics, beyond military strategy, Caesar was a man of immense intellectual appetite and insatiable curiosity about the world and its complexities. I deliberately appealed to both. I flattered his famed intellect subtly, drawing parallels between his current strategic challenges in Egypt and the legendary dilemmas faced by heroes and conquerors of antiquity, figures like Alexander, whose history I knew intimately from my studies at the Museum. We shared a light, knowing jest about the anecdote that he, Caesar, had wept before Alexander's statue in Spain, lamenting that Alexander had conquered the world at an age when Caesar felt he had achieved comparatively little. His eyes lit up with genuine pleasure at my reference. Clearly, he appreciated not just flattery, but the company of a well-read mind capable of meeting him on his own intellectual ground. In turn, he shared some of his thoughts, carefully, cautiously. He admitted, with visible distaste, that the gift of Pompey's severed head presented by Pothinus's faction had appalled him. He considered such treacherous expediency against a fellow Roman, even a defeated rival, deeply dishonorable. He characterized Ptolemy's advisors succinctly as possessing an abundance of cunning, but a notable deficit of honor. This carefully chosen phrase gave me a surge of hope. Caesar did not automatically take Ptolemy's side, despite the superficial legitimacy of the boy being the male co-ruler and the reigning power upon Caesar's arrival. My gamble seemed to be paying off. I sensed he was open to persuasion regarding who should truly lead Egypt in Rome's interest. Our first clandestine meeting stretched long into the night, the air thick with the scent of lamp oil, the weight of empires hanging in the balance, and the undeniable spark of mutual fascination. By the time the first pale rays of dawn crept through the high palace windows, painting the mosaic floor in shades of gray and rose, Julius Caesar and I had forged a connection that transcended mere political expediency. He saw in me, I believe, not just a deposed queen needing assistance, but someone worth considering seriously, a ruler of intellect and spirit, a potentially valuable partner, perhaps even a kindred ambitious soul. And I, for my part, saw in Caesar a man utterly unlike any I had previously known, formidable in his power, brilliant in his intellect, ruthless when necessary, yet capable of vision, charm, and grand dreams for the world he sought to command. In his focused presence, I felt a powerful spark, not just of renewed ambition, but of profound intellectual and perhaps even personal kinship. I dared to think, as his eyes lingered on mine with growing warmth, that he felt it too. All was far from settled, of course. Outside the relative safety of these palace walls, the city simmered on the verge of explosion. My brother's camp would soon inevitably learn I was here, within Caesar's protection. Indeed, As full morning broke, a furious clamor arose from beyond the palace gates. Pothinus and Achilles had discovered Caesar had a new, highly inconvenient guest, and they were incandescent with rage. Ptolemy the Fertiered himself, prodded into action by his handlers, marched to the palace courtyard with a large threatening mob of armed retainers and enraged citizens, loudly denouncing my perceived treachery and Caesar's unwarranted interference in Egyptian affairs. Caesar, emerging calmly into the courtyard, immediately took firm control of the volatile situation. With his characteristic cool authority, flanked by his disciplined Roman soldiers, he addressed the agitated crowd, stating firmly that as consul of Rome and friend of Egypt, he would impartially arbitrate the dispute between the royal siblings according to their father's will, ensuring justice for all. In a masterstroke, he kept Ptolemy the Fertiered with him, politely but effectively under guard, within the palace complex, promising safety to all parties if negotiations were respected and violence avoided. My brother's face, when he finally realized I stood calmly beside Caesar on the palace steps, within easy conversational distance of the mighty Roman consul, was a contorted mask of childish fury, betrayal, and utter disbelief. He shouted incoherent accusations and tried futilely to break free from the Roman guards restraining him, screaming hysterically that I had bewitched Caesar with vile Egyptian magic. Behind him, Pothinus and Theodotus stood pale-faced and seething with impotent rage, their carefully laid plans unraveling before their eyes. It was a dangerously volatile moment. One spark of uncontrolled violence could have ignited a bloodbath right there in the royal courtyard. But Caesar's imposing presence, the sheer disciplined readiness of his veteran Roman soldiers, and his calm projection of absolute authority managed to keep the explosive situation narrowly contained, for the time being. Thus, I found myself once more residing within the royal palace of Alexandria, but now under the complex, ambiguous status of a guest protected and perhaps subtly controlled by Roman power. The city outside remained perilously on edge. My own small mercenary army, camped uncertainly near the eastern border, awaited instructions in a strategic vacuum. Within the palace itself, a lethal game of intrigue and diplomacy began. Caesar formally called for a council to mediate between myself and Ptolemy, ostensibly to restore the peaceful co-rule mandated by my father's will. Pothinus and Theodotus pretended to cooperate, attending the initial sessions with outward displays of syrupy compliance and deference in Caesar's imposing presence, but I knew them far too well. Their eyes darted evasively, their promises felt hollow. They were clearly stalling, scheming, seeking ways to undermine Caesar's authority or eliminate me before his arbitration concluded favorably in my direction. Indeed, within mere days, the fragile, tense truce shattered irrevocably. Pothinus, blinded by arrogance and misjudging Caesar's decisiveness, attempted to secretly dispatch messages to Achilles, urging him to bring the main Egyptian army into Alexandria immediately and overwhelm Caesar's small contingent by force, eliminating both the Roman interloper and the problematic Queen Cleopatra in one swift stroke. But Pothinus, for all his cunning, was careless. His courier was intercepted by vigilant Roman patrols. Caesar, finally grasping the full depth of the treachery surrounding him and the imminent danger to his own position, acted with lightning speed and characteristic ruthlessness. Pothinus the eunuch, the spider at the center of the web, was summarily arrested and executed within the palace for his blatant treason against the mediating Roman authority. Theodotus, ever the coward, managed to slip away in the ensuing confusion and flee the city. History would lose track of his miserable fate. Achilles, however, already marching his army towards Alexandria in response to Pothinus's earlier, now intercepted instructions, found himself suddenly and unequivocally in open war with Julius Caesar's legions within the capital itself. So began what Roman history would call the Alexandrian War, a desperate, complex, and often chaotic struggle fought block by block. through the streets, canals, and harbors of my magnificent capital city. As full-scale violence erupted across Alexandria, Caesar acted swiftly to secure his position and his valuable political bargaining chips. He whisked my remaining siblings, the now politically isolated Ptolemy the and the unpredictable Arsinoe, along with myself, deeper into the most defensible section of the sprawling royal palace complex, ostensibly for our safety. Though treated with all outward courtesy due our royal status, we were, in truth, as much his hostages as his wards, our fates now utterly bound to his success. Achilles' sizable army, bolstered by enraged Alexandrian mobs who saw Caesar as an unwelcome foreign occupier meddling in their affairs, laid siege to the palace compound and the adjacent areas held by the Romans. All of a sudden, Julius Caesar, conqueror of Gaul, and Cleopatra, queen of Egypt, found ourselves trapped together, fighting desperately for survival within the very opulent halls and colonnaded courtyards where I had grown up. Fierce street battles raged just beyond our walls. The thudding impacts of catapult stones pounded against the palace defenses. Flaming arrows rained down into the inner courtyards, painting the night sky orange. Citizens frantically barricaded their homes against the spreading chaos, and the waters of the great harbor itself sometimes turned crimson with blood spilled during vicious naval skirmishes. Alexandria, the shining city of Hellenistic learning and Egyptian mystery, had become a brutal battleground, the prize in a deadly entanglement of Egyptian dynastic succession and Roman imperial ambition. Standing shoulder to shoulder with Caesar on a palace balcony one smoke-hazed afternoon, observing the destructive ebb and flow of the conflict, I watched in horror as flames devoured a line of vital grain warehouses near the docks, deliberately set alight during the chaos of urban warfare. Worse, sparks carried by the wind ignited the edge of our incomparable great library complex nearby. My heart clenched physically as I saw plumes of acrid smoke billowing from sections of the storied institution. Home to centuries of accumulated human knowledge, repository of irreplaceable scrolls. It felt as though the very soul of Alexandria were crying out in anguish. I turned my gaze instinctively to Caesar beside me. Did he fully grasp the enormity of what was potentially being lost in this struggle? It was not just a throne at stake here, but a civilization's precious legacy, burning amidst the flames of war. The grim, determined set of his jaw and the flicker of genuine distress in his eyes as he immediately dispatched soldiers to try and save what scrolls they could and contain the fire, told me that he did, at least in part, understand the cultural catastrophe unfolding. In that shared moment of dismay, witnessing his swift action to preserve knowledge, even amidst desperate battle, I knew with certainty that our fates, his and mine, were now inextricably, perhaps fatally, bound together. We would either restore order to this ravaged city together, or we would surely die together in its ashes, leaving behind only ruin and the tragic memory of what might have been. Within the besieged palace quarter, life quickly settled into a surreal, heightened rhythm dictated by the brutal realities of siege warfare. Days were relentlessly marked by the percussive thunder of Achilles' catapults pounding against the outer walls, the sharp, sudden cries of wounded Roman legionaries being carried back from desperate skirmishes fought in the labyrinthine streets nearby, the anxious, meticulous rationing of dwindling food and water supplies. Nights offered little genuine respite, frequently punctuated by sudden alarms triggering calls to arms, or illuminated by the eerie, flickering orange glow of fires burning uncontrolled in the city sectors held by the enemy forces. My beautiful, sophisticated, learned city was savagely tearing itself apart, and I, its queen, along with the master of Rome, were trapped at its very chaotic, besieged heart. Yet paradoxically, amidst the pervasive atmosphere of chaos, destruction, and imminent danger, a strange, intense intimacy began to grow between myself and Julius Caesar, forged white-hot in the shared crucible of extreme peril. We were queen and consul, allies thrown together by fate, fighting for our very survival, our individual destinies now inextricably interwoven with the outcome of this brutal Alexandrian war. Chapter 4. War, Love, and an Heir. The siege dragged on through the harsh Egyptian winter months of 48 into 47 BCE. The vast palace complex became our fortress, a besieged island amidst a sea of hostility stirred by Achilles and my ambitious sister Arsinoe, who had escaped the palace to join the rebels. Confined within these familiar walls, which now felt more like an opulent prison than a home, life became a strange, intense blend of military strategy, courtly routine maintained under duress, and the deepening, complex personal connection between myself and Caesar. Each day brought fresh perils and strategic challenges. Our food supply dwindled alarmingly. Water had to be carefully managed, drawn solely from palace cisterns, as Achilles' forces outside attempted to poison or cut off the canals feeding the royal quarter. Caesar, ever the master strategist even when cornered and vastly outnumbered, organized meticulous defenses with unnerving calm. His small contingent of Roman legionaries, hardened veterans disciplined by years of campaigns in Gaul, performed with astonishing courage and efficiency, repelling fierce attacks on the perimeter walls, launching daring night sorties into occupied parts of the city, and fortifying key positions within the palace grounds. Watching them operate, their coordinated movements a stark contrast to the often chaotic fervor of Achilles' larger, but less disciplined Egyptian troops, I grasped viscerally the source of Roman military dominance. It was not mere numbers, but relentless training, unwavering obedience, and precise execution. My role in this desperate struggle was far from passive. While Caesar commanded the Roman troops, I served as his indispensable source of local intelligence and logistical support. I knew Alexandria intimately, its hidden subterranean passages, the shifting loyalties, or resentments, of various city factions and ethnic quarters, the vulnerabilities in its infrastructure that might be exploited or defended. I directed my loyal Egyptian servants and palace guards, organized the strained distribution of remaining supplies, and, crucially, used my influence and knowledge of languages to maintain, where possible, clandestine communication with potential sympathizers outside the siege lines and within the city's diverse communities. I intercepted messages carried by captured runners, interrogated prisoners in their native tongues, often gleaning more than Roman officers could, and dispatched my own disguised agents on perilous missions. Caesar came to rely on my insights, a fact that bound us closer in shared purpose. It was during this time, amidst the chaos of battle near the harbor, that a terrible fire broke out as Caesar's forces fought desperately to maintain control of the docks and prevent Achilles from receiving reinforcements or supplies by sea. The flames, fanned by the sea breeze, spread with terrifying speed, engulfing warehouses filled with precious grain, timber, and papyrus destined for export. Tragically, the inferno leaped to buildings adjoining the Great Library, part of the Museion complex near the palace grounds. From the palace ramparts, watching the plumes of thick black smoke billow skyward, carrying the sickening, heartbreaking smell of burning papyrus scrolls, my heart constricted with a grief that felt physical. Centuries of accumulated knowledge, irreplaceable manuscripts detailing the wisdom of Egypt and Greece, potentially turning to ash due to the madness of war. Caesar, standing beside me, his face grim and set, cursed the unfortunate necessities of battle that had led to this cultural catastrophe and immediately dispatched soldiers to form bucket brigades, trying desperately to contain the blaze and save what structures and scrolls they could. While the entire library was not destroyed, as some later exaggerated accounts perhaps claimed for dramatic effect, significant portions were undeniably damaged or lost, a devastating wound inflicted upon the intellectual soul of my city by this bitter internal conflict, a loss I felt as keenly as any military defeat. Amidst the constant tension, the omnipresent danger, Caesar and I spent countless hours together, often late into the night, poring over maps spread across tables and lamplit chambers, planning the next day's defenses, debating strategies for breaking the deadlock. He possessed a mind of extraordinary sharpness and speed, capable of grasping complex military and political situations almost instantly, issuing clear, decisive commands. Yet, unlike many Roman commanders I had observed, he also listened intently to my counsel regarding Egyptian matters, respecting my understanding of my own people, my city, and the nuances of Ptolemaic court politics. He seemed to genuinely appreciate my education, my ability to converse with him not just as a queen needing rescue, but as an intellectual peer who could readily discuss Greek philosophy, analyze points of ancient history, or debate the strategies of Alexander, whom he clearly admired and sought to emulate. In the long, tense evenings, after the day's crises had momentarily subsided, and an uneasy quiet fell over the besieged palace, punctuated only by the distant cries of sentries or the mournful lap of water against the palace foundations, we sometimes found rare moments of quiet human connection. He would speak, surprisingly candidly at times, of his grueling campaigns in Gaul, of the treacherous intricacies of Roman politics, of his far-reaching ambition for reforming Rome and its empire. I, in turn, would share stories of Egypt's ancient history, attempt to explain the profound mysteries of our gods, particularly the all-encompassing significance of Isis, the Great Mother, whose living embodiment I felt myself striving to be, especially in this time of crisis. He listened, fascinated, his usual pragmatism occasionally giving way to a flicker of wonder, perhaps seeing in Egypt's deep roots and traditions of divine kingship something that resonated with his own burgeoning sense of personal destiny, his own subtle yet unmistakable move away from purely republican ideals towards a more centralized, almost monarchical form of authority. A profound, undeniable intimacy blossomed between us in those shared dangerous hours, an intensity born of mutual respect, intellectual kinship, and the powerful, almost magnetic electricity that sparked when two formidable, ambitious souls find themselves thrown together, allied against a hostile world. His hand lingered perhaps a moment longer than necessary, brushed mine over a map. His direct gaze held mine across the flickering lamplight, with an intensity that went beyond mere strategic discussion, and I, despite the peril, despite the uncertainty, I found myself drawn irresistibly to his commanding presence, his piercing intellect, his surprisingly dry humor could surface even amidst the grimmest circumstances, and the sheer force of his will that seemed capable of bending reality itself. In the heart of a besieged palace, surrounded by enemies plotting our destruction, Queen Cleopatra VII of Egypt and Gaius Julius Caesar, dictator of Rome, became lovers. It was a union forged in peril, a dangerous charged liaison that inextricably intertwined the fate of nations with the unpredictable, powerful currents of the human heart. As winter's chill grudgingly gave way to the first warmth of spring, our military situation remained precarious, but distant hope finally arrived like the returning sun. Word eventually filtered through the blockade, carried by daring messengers, that vital reinforcements, commanded by Caesar's loyal ally Mithridates of Pergamum, were approaching overland from Syria. Simultaneously, Roman legions Caesar had urgently summoned from Asia Minor were rumored to be nearing by sea. The strategic tide, long against us, was finally about to turn. Caesar, reinvigorated by the news, immediately devised a characteristically daring plan to break the siege and link up with Mithridates. Leaving a sufficient garrison under trusted officers to hold the palace complex, he led the bulk of his seasoned forces in a surprise amphibious assault across the harbor under cover of darkness, securing a critical foothold on the mainland shore outside the main siege lines. The fighting was reportedly fierce, with Caesar himself, according to eyewitness accounts that quickly spread, having to swim desperately for his life at one point after his command boat was sunk by enemy fire, clutching vital strategic documents above the churning water with one hand while swimming with the other, an image of resolute leadership that further burnished his legend among his men. From this hard-won beachhead, he marched swiftly inland to rendezvous with Mithridates' advancing army. Their combined forces then decisively engaged the main Egyptian army, led nominally now by my brother Ptolemy Terterained, who had earlier managed to slip out of the palace and join his troops, eager to assert his kingship, but effectively commanded by Ganymedes, Arsinoe's ambitious eunuch advisor, Achilles himself having been predictably sidelined and executed amidst the constant lethal intrigues and power struggles within the rebel camp. Such was the chaotic nature of their leadership. The final conclusive battle, fought near the Canopic branch of the Nile just outside Alexandria's western approaches, was a complete rout for the Egyptian forces. Caught between Caesar's disciplined Roman legions attacking from the city side and Mithridates' determined reinforcements engaging their rear, the Egyptian army, despite its numbers, broke and fled in disarray. In the ensuing chaos and panic, Ptolemy Terterained, my young brother, attempted to escape the battlefield by crossing the river on an overcrowded barge. The vessel, overloaded with fleeing soldiers and heavy equipment, tragically capsized under the weight. Burdened by the ceremonial golden armor he wore as pharaoh, the young king, my brother, vanished into the muddy, swirling waters of the Nile and drowned. He was only 13 years old, a pawn consumed by the deadly game his advisors had played. When the news reached me within the palace that Caesar was overwhelmingly victorious, the rebel army shattered, Achilles' commanders slain or captured, and my brother Ptolemy dead by drowning, a complex wave of contradictory emotions washed over me. There was the undeniable surge of triumph, the profound relief of survival, the swift confirmation of my restored authority as sole monarch. But alongside the victory came a deep, genuine sadness for the young life tragically lost, for the brother fate and ambitious men had twisted into an adversary, his brief, unhappy reign extinguished by the very river that symbolized our kingdom's eternal life. Arsinoe, my rebellious sister, was captured shortly thereafter by Roman patrols, her own brief, defiant bid for power ending not in glory, but in humiliation and captivity. Caesar returned to Alexandria not merely as an arbiter or ally, but as the undisputed conqueror who had secured my throne and crushed all opposition. He presented himself before me in the main hall of the palace, not with the arrogance of a victor demanding submission, but with a quiet warmth in his eyes that spoke volumes of our shared ordeal and ultimate triumph. I greeted him formally, with the dignity befitting the restored Queen of Egypt, but my own gaze surely conveyed the depth of my gratitude and the unique, unbreakable bond we now shared. Egypt was mine once more, secured undeniably by Roman military might, yes, but ruled now unequivocally and solely by me, Cleopatra. In the immediate aftermath, Caesar acted swiftly and decisively to stabilize the volatile situation. Arsinoe, deemed too dangerous to remain in Egypt where she might become a focus for further rebellion, was dispatched under guard to Rome, destined to await Caesar's grand triumph. To maintain the superficial appearance of the Ptolemaic tradition of dual monarchy, and perhaps to placate conservative Egyptian factions, my youngest brother, barely 11 years old and posing no real political threat, was brought forth from the nursery wing of the palace and formally crowned as Ptolemy XIV, becoming my nominal co-ruler and by tradition my husband. It was, however, a necessary political fiction. Everyone at court and beyond understood clearly that true power, absolute and undivided, now resided solely with me. With peace finally restored to Alexandria and Egypt seemingly secure under my rule, backed by a strong garrison of Roman legions Caesar decided to leave behind, Caesar lingered in my kingdom for several unexpectedly blissful months throughout the spring and summer of 47 BCE. He seemed genuinely captivated by the ancient land, its monumental wonders that dwarfed even Rome's achievements, its profound mysteries, and perhaps, I dared to believe, genuinely captivated by its queen. We embarked on that now famed, luxurious voyage up the Nile, a grand leisurely procession on magnificent royal barges, adorned with silks and flowers, accompanied by enchanting music, sumptuous feasting, and stimulating intellectual conversation that flowed as freely as the river itself. It was a time of profound healing after the trauma of the siege, a period of quiet celebration of our shared victory, and an opportunity for the deepening of our personal connection away from the pressures of war and politics. With genuine fascination, I showed him the awe-inspiring temples of Luxor and Karnak, attempted to explain the complex symbolism of the hieroglyphs covering their ancient walls, initiated him into some of the more accessible mysteries of Egyptian cosmology and our intricate pantheon of gods. He, in turn, listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking surprisingly insightful questions, and spoke with remarkable openness of Rome, of his ambitious plans for its future, of the vast interconnected world he intended to shape under Roman guidance. It was during this idyllic journey, drifting lazily under the warm, benevolent gaze of the Egyptian sun, sailing upon the sacred river that had nourished my ancestors for millennia, surrounded by peace and luxury, that I knew with growing certainty I carried Caesar's child. The realization filled me with a joy so fierce, so profound, it felt almost dangerous, sacred. A child conceived not merely out of political alliance or fleeting passion born of danger, but born, I felt, of a true meeting of powerful minds and convergent spirits. An heir who would carry the potent blood of the pharaohs and the formidable legacy of Rome's greatest living man, a potential bridge between two worlds. When I finally chose the right moment, perhaps under a moonlit sky reflecting on the calm waters of the Nile, to share the momentous news with Caesar, his reaction was one of undisguised delight mixed with a sudden, profound seriousness. He embraced me tightly, whispering against my hair, his voice filled with an almost awed emotion I had rarely heard from him: a son. Let it be a son, Cleopatra. A son. Perhaps he can unite our worlds. His words resonated perfectly with the deepest, most fiercely protected hopes stirring within my own heart. Soon after our return to Alexandria, however, the inescapable demands of empire called him away. Urgent news arrived detailing Farnes's revolt in Asia Minor, a challenge to Roman authority that necessitated his immediate military attention. Our farewell on the bustling docks of Alexandria was imbued with genuine emotion, filled with murmured promises of swift return, fervent assurances of enduring political alliance, and personal affection. He left 3 trusted legions behind under the command of Rufio, ostensibly to ensure my security against any remaining internal threats, but also serving as a tangible sign of his strategic commitment to Egypt and perhaps to me. As his ship, bearing the eagle standards of Rome, caught the wind and sailed out past the Pharos lighthouse towards the open Mediterranean, I stood watching, one hand resting protectively, almost unconsciously, on my gently rounding belly. I felt not abandoned or diminished, but strangely empowered. I was Queen of Egypt, sovereign ruler of my kingdom, carrying the future, potentially the future of 2 great civilizations within me. On the 23rd day of the month of Paoni in the Egyptian calendar, corresponding to late June in the Roman year of 47 BCE, I gave birth to my son. He was strong, healthy, strikingly beautiful, with eyes that already seemed to hold a spark of keen intelligence. I named him Ptolemy Caesar, acknowledging his dual heritage boldly for all the world to know and understand, though among the palace staff and the people of Alexandria, he would quickly become known by the affectionate diminutive Caesarian Little Caesar. His birth was hailed throughout Egypt with joyous festivals and solemn thanksgiving rites in the temples, widely interpreted as a powerful sign of divine favor upon my reign, a symbol of renewed hope after years of turmoil, the potential dawn of a glorious new golden age where the strength of Rome might protect, not dominate, the ancient wisdom and bounty of the Nile. Holding my tiny son in my arms, gazing down into eyes that seemed to hold unmistakable echoes of his father's brilliance, I felt my life's purpose sharpen into crystalline focus, my resolve solidify into tempered steel. I would protect this precious child, nurture his extraordinary legacy, and dedicate my reign to ensuring that Egypt, under our joint rule, would rise again, proud and prosperous, to claim its rightful, respected place among the great powers of the earth. The deadly game of thrones within Egypt had been decisively won, for now. The far greater, more complex game, shaping the future destiny of empires, had just begun. Chapter 5. A Queen in Caesar's City. I arrived in Rome amid calculated pomp and deeply felt uncertainty. Our galleys docked at Ostia in late summer of 46 BCE, the air thick with the unfamiliar smells of damp earth and pine, so different from Alexandria's brine and blossoms. From there, my entourage and I traveled up the muddy Tiber to the formidable capital of the world. Caesar had arranged splendid quarters for me in one of his own estates, the Horti Caesaris, sprawling gardens just beyond the city's sacred boundary, offering a measure of privacy, yet positioning me conspicuously under his patronage. It was a beautiful villa, striving for Hellenistic grace, but Rome itself felt dense, masculine, almost aggressively pragmatic compared to the luminous elegance of my Alexandria. The very stones seemed to emanate power and ancient, republican severity. Caesar welcomed me with genuine warmth and visible pride, presenting me to Roman society not merely as a guest, but as a significant allied monarch. It was a bold move, flying in the face of traditional Roman suspicion towards foreign rulers, especially queens. He introduced me to his inner circle. I recall a tense dinner where I found myself seated near Marcus Tullius Cicero, the famed orator, whose sharp eyes dissected me, even as he offered polite, probing questions about Egyptian philosophy. Sensing his underlying skepticism, his assessment of me as perhaps an exotic, dangerous influence, I paired gracefully, quoting Latin poets alongside Greek classics, refusing to be categorized as some uncultured barbarian queen. His thin lips tightened. I believe my ability to meet him on intellectual ground only confirmed his prejudice against my perceived arrogance. He later wrote scathingly of me, I learned, unable to stomach Caesar treating a woman, a foreign queen, with such open favor and near equal footing. His disapproval was a chilling reminder of the deep-seated Roman biases I navigated. Those months in Rome were among the strangest and most complex of my life. Outwardly, I played the role of the honored dignitary, attending public events when required, receiving visitors with studied charm. Inwardly, I constantly navigated a treacherous web of political intrigue and personal perception. I could stroll incognito through the crowded forum, marveling at the sheer scale of Roman power expressed in stone and law, but always felt the weight of curious or hostile eyes. Roman noblewomen sometimes visited, their fascination often tinged with disdain, peering at my Egyptian decor, and the small gazelle I kept as a pet, as if examining curiosities in a zoo. I obliged them with practiced politeness, offering tastes of Egyptian dates or demonstrating the art of kohl, knowing their reports back to their influential husbands could subtly shape opinion. One surprising source of comfort was Caesar's wife, Calpurnia. A sensible, dignified Roman matron, she bore Caesar's relationship with me with remarkable grace, perhaps long accustomed to his complex life. She showed genuine kindness towards me and was utterly captivated by little Caesarion, showering him with gentle affection during our quiet visits. In those rare moments, sharing observations about our vastly different worlds, hers constrained by Roman tradition, mine demanding constant vigilance, and command a quiet understanding formed between us. Two women bound by circumstance to the same extraordinary, world-altering man. Julius, immersed in the whirlwind of consolidating his supreme authority, still carved out time for me. He proudly showed me his new Forum Julium, and there, in the gleaming temple of Venus Genitrix ancestress of his Julian line, stood a magnificent golden statue. My statue, placed alongside the goddess. My breath caught, my cheeks flushed with a complex mix of astonishment, immense pride, and a flicker of apprehension at such a provocative public declaration of our bond, and perhaps of my son's significance. He pointed out across the expanse of Rome from the Capitoline Hill, speaking of grand plans to rebuild the city, to make it a capital truly worthy of world dominion, perhaps even inspired, he teased, by Alexandria's beauty. He seemed near the peak of his power, reshaping Rome's destiny with boundless energy. Yet, beneath the surface of his seemingly unassailable control, dangerous undercurrents swirled. Many conservative senators bristled at the unprecedented honors Caesar accumulated: multiple triumphs, a permanent gilded chair in the Senate, the title Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. Republican sentiment, though weakened, remained deeply ingrained in the Roman psyche. Attending the lavish games he hosted, I sometimes heard cries of, "Rex! Rex! King!" rising from the adoring plebeian crowd, a sound that made Caesar visibly flinch and subtly signal for restraint. Rome, I sensed, teetered on a knife's edge between gratitude for the peace he had brought and deep-seated terror of monarchy. And I, an actual monarch residing in his gardens, inevitably became a symbol, rightly or wrongly, of those autocratic ambitions some Romans feared he harbored. The Ides of March, in 44 BCE, dawned crisp and unsettlingly clear. A sense of foreboding had hung heavy in the air for weeks. Tales of ill omens, whispered conspiracies. Calpurnia, pale and distraught, confided her terrifying nightmares of Caesar bleeding in her arms and desperately implored him not to attend the Senate meeting that day. I too felt a knot of anxiety tightening deep within me, an inexplicable dread. But Caesar, ever fatalistic, brushed off our concerns with a weary impatience. What can happen to Caesar in the Senate House, surrounded by his peers? He reassured us that morning, dismissing our fears as womanly vapors. Duty, and perhaps a refusal to show fear, compelled him to go. He was to receive a delegation petitioning him on provincial matters. He departed our villa around mid-morning, adjusting his purple-bordered toga, looking every inch the invincible leader of Rome. He turned the garden gate to offer a brief, familiar wave. That casual gesture, etched forever in my memory, was the last time I saw him alive. The hours that followed passed with an unnatural quiet, pregnant with unspoken tension. Then, a sudden chaotic clamor at the villa gates. One of Caesar's personal attendants burst in, face ashen, eyes wide with terror, stammering out fragmented, horrifying words. Act, daggers, Senate, Pompey's statue, Caesar is dead. Calpurnia let out a heart-wrenching cry and collapsed, insensible with grief. I felt the marble floor beneath me lurch, the world tilting into a horrifying void. My mind recoiled, refusing to accept the impossible truth. Dead? Not Julius, not the man who had conquered Gaul, survived countless battles, outwitted innumerable enemies, the man who seemed sculpted by destiny itself. I seized the terrified messenger, shaking him, demanding coherence, my voice rising, cracking with disbelief and incipient panic. Slowly, piece by horrifying piece, the ghastly picture assembled. A wide conspiracy of senators, perhaps 60 or more. A sudden, brutal ambush near the base of his rival Pompey's statue. A frenzy of daggers flashing in the Senate hall. Caesar fighting back initially. Then, seeing his trusted friend Marcus Brutus among the attackers, ceasing his resistance with a legendary sigh, pulling his toga over his face in final weary dignity as they struck him down. 23 stab wounds. He fell, bleeding profusely, his lifeblood staining the very heart of the republic he had sought to reshape. I cannot recall the rest of that terrible day without a visceral shudder. Shock, searing rage, paralyzing terror, all surged through me in waves. My first coherent thought amidst the maelstrom was for my son Caesarion. Was he safe? Would the assassins, having eliminated the father, now come for the son, the living proof of Caesar's connection to Egypt? Or for me, the foreign queen associated with his perceived tyranny? Through a haze of grief and fear, I gave sharp orders to my loyal attendants: bar the gates, arm the household guard, prepare for the worst. Outside the villa walls, chaos gripped Rome. Confused and fearful crowds surged through the streets, some lamenting Caesar, others uncertain, while rumors flew wildly. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal co-consul and right-hand man, had reportedly fled the city disguised as a slave, fearing he would be the assassin's next target. No one knew who held power, what horrors the night might bring. In the ensuing days, Rome became a volatile cauldron of political maneuvering, public grief, and simmering violence. I remained secluded within the villa for safety, receiving fragmented updates. Antony eventually emerged, allied briefly with Lepidus, and courageously took charge of Caesar's will and personal papers, skillfully managing the volatile situation. Through discreet intermediaries, I learned the staggering contents of that will. To my profound surprise and bitter heartbreak, Caesar had named not our son Caesarion, deemed too young, perhaps, or too politically explosive a choice for Rome, but his 18-year-old grandnephew, Octavian, as his primary heir and adopted son. Octavian, a relative unknown, a boy Caesar had recently taken under his wing. While Caesar left me certain properties and funds, generous by normal standards, but feeling almost like afterthoughts, the omission of Caesarion from the main inheritance, from formal adoption, stung deeply. It felt like a repudiation, a denial of the significance of our bond and our son's potential. But perhaps my political mind reasoned through the pain. Caesar, ever the supreme Roman pragmatist, even in contemplating his legacy, knew that naming a half-Egyptian child, however beloved, as heir to Rome itself was simply untenable, an invitation to immediate civil war. Regardless, any line of succession meant little if the assassins, led by Brutus and Cassius, managed to seize control. For the moment, however, Antony and Caesar's allies held the city in an uneasy truce with the conspirators. Caesar's public funeral was planned for the Forum. Despite the palpable danger and my precarious position, I resolved to attend, concealed, anonymous. I owed Julius that final farewell. Hidden deep within the throng of grieving commoners, veiled and draped in plain mourning garb, I witnessed the dramatic funeral rites of Gaius Julius Caesar. I saw Mark Antony deliver his masterful eulogy, skillfully playing on the crowd's emotions, controversially lifting Caesar's blood-soaked torn toga to reveal the gruesome wounds, pointedly naming the conspirators, especially Brutus, the most unkindest cut of all. The crowd, artfully roused from sorrow to vengeful fury, erupted into riots, setting fire to the Senate House itself in their rage, ultimately driving the assassins from the city. As the flames of Caesar's funeral pyre leaped towards the Roman sky, and the mob howled for retribution, I slipped away quietly through the chaotic streets. It was starkly clear there was no longer any place for me or my son in the violent convulsions now shaking Rome to its foundations. My protector was gone. My continued presence was perilous, potentially fatal. Within days, the decision to leave was made. Antony, now emerging as a key figure in the post-Caesar power struggle, proved surprisingly understanding and helpful, sending word assuring me of safe passage should I wish to return immediately to Egypt. It was undeniably for the best. With Caesarion held close, surrounded by my remaining loyal retinue, we departed Italy, our hearts heavy with loss and apprehension. Gazing one last time at the receding, hazy outline of Rome's 7 hills, I whispered a silent promise into the Mediterranean winds. Julius, your death will be avenged, and your son will be honored. I will raise him to embody the best of both our worlds, whatever Rome may say. The journey back to Alexandria was somber, shrouded in grief, yet underscored by a steely new resolve. I had left Egypt 2 years prior as a confident queen, powerful consort to the seemingly invincible master of Rome. I returned effectively a widow, clinging fiercely to the one precious living piece of Caesar I had left, our remarkable child. Throughout the long voyage, staring out over the vast, indifferent expanse of the sea, my thoughts raced, analyzing the drastically altered political landscape. Without Caesar's direct patronage, how could I possibly secure my throne indefinitely, let alone safeguard Caesarion's precarious future? Would Rome, once its internal struggles resolved, inevitably turn its covetous eyes towards Egypt's wealth and strategic position? I realized with stark clarity that my survival, and Caesarion's, now depended entirely on my own resources, my own cunning, and the enduring strength and loyalty of my Egyptian kingdom. We would stand or fall not as dependent appendages to Rome, but proudly on our own terms. Upon reaching the familiar, bustling harbor of Alexandria, I immediately set about consolidating my position with ruthless efficiency. My younger brother, Ptolemy the 13th, now approaching 15, had nominally ruled in my absence, guided by cautious advisors. But I knew that some ambitious courtiers, sensing my weakened Roman connection, might begin to see the pliable young king as a more controllable alternative to me. I would not risk another destabilizing power struggle like the one that had led to my previous exile. Father's final warning about trusting no one, especially blood relatives, in proximity to the throne, echoed grimly in my memory. Thus, I acted with the swiftness and severity demanded by the harsh realities of Ptolemaic rule. Within weeks of my return, Ptolemy the 14th was dead, officially succumbing to a sudden virulent illness, though whispers of expertly administered poison were inevitably rife throughout the court. I shed no public tears and offer no confession here. Suffice it to say, I ensured no physician could intervene in time, and no incriminating evidence could point directly to my hand. He was my brother, little more than a boy, and in the quiet solitude of my chambers, I mourned the tragic necessity of his removal. But I had learned the brutal lessons of survival etched in the history of my own family. I would not gamble Egypt's stability or my son's future on the mere hope of my brother's continued cooperation. Egypt could have only one undisputed ruler now, Cleopatra. And so, in the autumn of 44 BCE, I took the crucial step of formally declaring my son, Ptolemy the 15th Caesarion, now a bright and observant 3-year-old, as my official co-ruler of Egypt. In a grand, carefully orchestrated ceremony before the assembled populace of Alexandria, near the symbolic Pharos lighthouse, I held him aloft, presenting him clad in miniature pharaonic regalia. I proclaimed him not just pharaoh, but with deliberate emphasis, King of Kings, beloved of Ptah, son of the god Julius Caesar. The crowd roared its approval, a mixture perhaps of genuine loyalty to me, awe at the child's lineage, relief at the prospect of renewed stability, and patriotic pride in seeing the might of Rome symbolically merged with the divinity of Egypt embodied in this small boy. It was a masterstroke of political theater and potent propaganda, as much as a mother's act of fierce protective love. Yet, even as I skillfully solidified my power base at home, reinforcing my alliances with the Egyptian priesthood and ensuring the loyalty of the army, I kept a keenly watchful eye on Rome's unfolding internal drama. The assassins Brutus and Cassius had fled east, gathering formidable legions in Greece and Asia Minor. Back in Rome, Mark Antony and young Octavian, Caesar's unexpected calculating heir, had forged an uneasy alliance with a third general, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. They formally established themselves as the second triumvirate, vowing to hunt down Caesar's murderers and divide the Roman world amongst themselves. The Republic plunged once more into the bloody throes of civil war. This internal Roman conflict, ironically, granted me a precious breathing space, diverting Roman attention and resources away from Egypt for a critical period. Nonetheless, both warring factions courted my support, or at least my neutrality. They knew Egypt's legendary wealth could fund many legions, and its vast grain supply could feed armies. Cassius, one of Caesar's chief murderers, controlling much of the east temporarily, sent envoys demanding that Egypt contribute its fleet and substantial treasure to aid the Republican cause against Antony and Octavian. He coupled his demands with thinly veiled threats, If I refused, I would be treated as an enemy once they inevitably prevailed. In truth, my heart held nothing but contempt for the men who had treacherously slain the father of my child. My sympathies and my strategic interests clearly lay with Caesar's avengers, Antony and Octavian, though I had not yet met Octavian personally, and Antony I knew primarily through Caesar's complex recollections and by his growing reputation as a formidable general. Thus, I responded to Cassius's demands with calculated delay and prevarication. I formally promised only meager contributions, pleading that a recent storm, conveniently unverifiable, had damaged our fleet, and that poor harvests, plausible given recent Nile fluctuations, severely strained our treasury. It was a dangerous game of deception, playing for time while covertly offering quiet, deniable support to Antony and Octavian's agents operating in the East. As luck, or perhaps the subtle intervention of Isis, would have it, a genuine, ferocious storm did arise in the eastern Mediterranean shortly thereafter, scattering and wrecking the few token warships I belatedly dispatched towards Cassius's fleet. This act of nature spared me from having to openly defy Cassius while conveniently appearing to have fulfilled my reluctant attempt to comply with his demands. Cassius reportedly fumed at the loss and my perceived lukewarm support. But before he could contemplate punitive action against Egypt, larger events rapidly overtook him. In 42 BCE, the powerful armies of the triumvirs, Antony and Octavian, finally confronted the forces of Brutus and Cassius on the plains of Philippi in Macedonia. In two decisive battles, the assassins' legions were crushed. Both Cassius and Brutus, facing inevitable capture, chose suicide over humiliation. Julius Caesar, my brilliant, lost Julius, was avenged at last. With their enemies eliminated, the victorious triumvirs proceeded to divide the vast Roman world amongst themselves. Young Octavian, shrewdly leveraging his position as Caesar's heir, secured control of Rome itself and the western provinces. The aging Lepidus was assigned the wealthy province of Africa, and to Mark Antony, the proven military powerhouse of the triumvirate, fell the administration of the entire opulent complex East, a domain stretching from Greece across Asia Minor and Syria, explicitly including oversight of allied and client kingdoms, chief among them, my Egypt. The prospect of Mark Antony, the man I recalled from fleeting impressions in Rome, admired from afar for his role in Caesar's funeral. The charismatic General Caesar himself had regarded with a mix of affection and exasperation. Calling him my noble, sometimes foolish Antony, coming into direct, powerful contact with Egypt stirred a complex mixture of hope and anxiety within me. He was now arguably the most powerful individual military commander in the entire Roman Empire, commanding dozens of veteran legions. He was also widely known for his soldierly virtues and equally notorious vices: undeniable bravery, lavish generosity, appealing bluntness, but also a penchant for excessive indulgence, a love of luxury, and a susceptibility to passionate impulses. I recalled vividly Caesar's nuanced descriptions of Antony. Not a cold calculator like Octavian was reputed to be, nor a deep strategist like Caesar himself, but a man of immense physical courage and charisma, capable of inspiring fierce loyalty in his troops, someone who might relish a drunken revel as much as leading a desperate cavalry charge. I sensed immediately that dealing with Antony would require a very different approach than the intellectual sparring and calculated diplomacy I had employed with Caesar. If Julius was a finely honed rapier, Antony was a powerful broadsword, devastatingly effective in the right hands, perhaps, but less subtle, more direct, driven as much by emotion and appetite as by cold reason. Still, he was now the Roman gatekeeper of my kingdom's future, the successor to Caesar's influence in the East. If I could somehow win him to my side, secure his friendship and alliance as I had once secured Caesar's, then perhaps Egypt could navigate the treacherous post-Civil War landscape and enjoy another period of protected stability and prosperity. Perhaps, just perhaps, Caesarion's uncertain future could be safeguarded under Antony's powerful shield. Thus, as I settled back into the familiar rhythms of ruling my kingdom, personally overseeing Nile irrigation projects, presiding over elaborate religious festivals like the revered Apis bull consecration, adjudicating complex trade disputes in the bustling commercial courts of Alexandria, I remained ever mindful that a new critical chapter of my life and Egypt's destiny was rapidly approaching on the horizon. My heart bore the deep scars of loss, grief, and betrayal, but it beat resolutely, driven by the sacred duty I bore as pharaoh. I was the living Isis, mother of Caesarion, unchallenged queen of kings in my own realm. With Rome's devastating civil wars temporarily quelled and a new triumviral order uneasily established, I understood with absolute clarity that another great test of my reign loomed large. Reports began to trickle in from Syria and Asia Minor. Antony, consolidating his control over the eastern provinces, would soon summon the various client rulers, myself foremost among them, to account for their actions during the recent conflicts and, more importantly, to affirm their loyalty and contribute resources for his grand ambitions, particularly his planned retaliatory campaign against the Parthian Empire. Our meeting, I knew, was inevitable, and so I began to prepare, mentally, strategically, assessing Antony's known character, gathering intelligence on his advisors, marshaling Egypt's resources, considering my approach just as I had years earlier before my fateful, carpet-wrapped arrival before Caesar. I would be ready when the summons came from Mark Antony. I would be ready to meet him not as a defeated supplicant or a frightened vassal, but as the proud, intelligent, and resourceful sovereign queen of Egypt, prepared to charm, to negotiate, perhaps even to captivate, in order to secure the future of my kingdom and my legacy. Little did I fathom then how profoundly, how irrevocably, that impending meeting with Mark Antony would change not only my own life, but the very course of history itself. But that is ever the way of destiny. We walk forward resolutely, carrying the heavy weight of our past, our eyes fixed hopefully on the uncertain horizon, while the gods, perhaps, smile faintly at how little we mortals truly know of the surprising, dangerous, glorious road that lies ahead.